Hey everyone, following up from my last few videos on how to model, optimize, and UV map complex objects, this video will focus on how to import and set up your 3D models that use UDIMs in Substance Painter. I will cover final model preparation, the import-export process, baking mesh maps with high to low detail, and how to use UV tiles, masks, and material IDs to organize your work in Substance Painter. I will be using Maya for this demo, but the concepts and workflows discussed here can be applied to any 3D software. As always, a like, subscribe, and share is always appreciated as I continue to grow the content of this channel. So with that, let's get started. Alright, so here we are in Maya, and the first thing that I want to cover is just the final preparation on the model and final checks on UVs. Alright, so as you can see here, we have the low poly model, or the optimized version of the high poly subdivided version here. This is sitting at about 12,000 faces, or just under 24,000 triangles, which is going to be used as a hero asset for some high-res renders and for some high-res resolution captures out of the real-time software. All right, and then we have here the subdivided version that we're going to be going over shortly. Now, it's just some basic cleanup stuff is typically, at least Maya specific, is selecting the model, deleting history, and freezing transforms. The other thing that I like to do is just go to File, Optimize Scene Size, and you can hit the dialog box there. And what this does is just it goes ahead and gets rid of a lot of the fluff and stuff that you don't need throughout the scene file and just cleans things up. So you go ahead and hit apply and it goes ahead and does that. Keep in mind it's not undoable, so make sure to save before doing this. So you go ahead and do OK, and you go ahead and have a smaller and cleaner scene file and gets rid of all of those annoying nodes inside of your hierarchy. Once we have our scene and project cleaned up, the next thing that we want to do is take a look at the normals of our object. So in Maya specifically, if you select your object and you hold shift right click, you can see you have soften, harden edges, and then you can do harden edge and soften edge. Now typically we want to go ahead, especially when baking detail, and do a full soften edge. Now just so you know the difference, this is what it would look like with harden edged. You may find some faceting and not really issues, but they'll cause issues when you go to bake. I see a lot of people, a lot of students, when they go and start doing the baking for the first time, they forget to soften their edges and to apply smoothing groups to your models. And you'd find smoothing groups pretty much in any other software. 3ds Max also uses smoothing groups. You can also find that here at the top with mesh display and then soften edge. So go ahead and just soften edge, and that goes ahead and just smooths all the face information, edge information, and it uses an angle of 180 degrees, which is exactly what we want because it's going to smooth all of the edges here regardless of the angle. You can see this is a 90-degree edge between these two faces here, and it's just going to go ahead and smooth that. All right, and what we're going to do again is just bake this high poly detail down to this, the low poly, which is why we want to go ahead and set that smoothing group. All right, so once the softened edges are all set, the next thing we want to do is quickly check our UVs. And if you go to UV editor, you can see that in here, and if I go ahead and actually select the low poly, you can see that our UDIMs are all properly set up. Now what I've done is went ahead and just kind of created just a little subgroup in here that organizes everything based on the UV channel or the UV coordinates. And you can see that it went ahead and everything's looking pretty clean here. I did go ahead and organize this from the last video that just makes a little bit more sense, and I gave this about 5 UDIMs. All right, so you can see we have 1 through 5, and this is just my naming convention. But if I go ahead and actually select some objects, you can see this in the coordinate system 1003, and I just made this group 1003, and then same thing here for 104 or 1004 and then 1005. Now here's the key thing. You have to be very careful when exporting into Substance Painter, or else it'll cause issues. Is if sometimes you use the layout here and you go ahead and do layout and it goes ahead and tries to pack it. And what you may find is that sometimes when it goes ahead and packs it, there may be some UV shells that are bleeding over. And so you'll notice it within the coordinate system. If you have this enabled here, which is just going to do the display image with this checkerboard. I typically like doing that just as a quick check to make sure that I have no bleed over into any other UDIM tiles here. All right, so I'll go ahead and undo that and make sure all my UVs are good and I have everything organized properly and I have everything structured very cleanly. And you can see how I have it here with these groups that are just there just for the sake of organization. And then within here, we'll take a look at quickly looking at naming convention. Naming convention is going to be incredibly important because I want Substance Painter to know when it bakes this top piece to bake and take all the information from just this top piece here. Okay, now it's going to go ahead and do that because these two are the same names except for the underscore. So you can see here, this is mesh underscore top underscore low. This is, if I go ahead and hit this, mesh underscore top underscore high. So it's going to find the same name and then find underscore low underscore high, and then use those specifically for baking, which is going to help, especially when we have a lot of intricate details. And I don't want any issues when I bake this top piece for it to maybe pick up some of the surrounding piece here. So if I go ahead and actually disable the checkerboard, you can kind of see what I mean. Sometimes with very tight pieces in here, that will cause issues when you're baking. Now we can always, do another bake with ambient occlusion if we need that. But for now, I want to make sure to pull primarily the curvature information, the normal information, and everything that I need from this high poly model. Okay, so that's why naming is very important. And as long as the objects are based off of the same name, you're fine even if you have some subgroups. I ran a couple of tests and everything worked fine when it was in Substance Painter. All right, so after naming conventions and everything's clean, the next thing we want to take a look at is the material IDs. So I just went ahead and just started applying just materials to the high poly and not the low poly. That's because I want to capture this color information to create masks for the low poly. Now, keep in mind when working in Substance Painter, and I'll show a quick sample of this or a quick demo, is that when you do use multiple materials in Substance Painter, you're going to have multiple texture sets. So for in this instance, I want this to at least be one texture set with multiple UDIM tiles, and then we'll also use masks. And then I'll also show you how, if you wanted to break this up into multiple materials or multiple texture sets and also use UDIMs, you can still do that. All right. So the material IDs are basically broken up based off of the reference that I have right over here. And you can see kind of how things are broken out. And here's the cyberpunk reference of this that I found on ArtStation from Filippo Bertino. And you can see how basically things are broken up. So you can see basically these metal pieces here I have all as kind of one main object or one main material ID. And you'll see that I have the top and bottom ones as the same material IDs, and then the mid piece, and then the glass, and so on and so forth. There's also some internal components here that I also have broken up. So that is basically what I'm using. And you'll see also how I've gone ahead and broken this up, where we have the blue here being that separate material ID, and then the green piece, even though it's all one combined object here, I can create custom masks from this material ID and color ID, and I'll show you how to set that up. It's incredibly powerful. All right, so those are the key things as far as just quick model preparation. So you want to make sure that you optimize and clean your scene, clean up your models, make sure that your normals are all set up, make sure your UDIMs are cleaned, use proper naming conventions, and then use material IDs where you can. Once all of that is set up, I will go ahead now and set this sub D back to the same origin point as the low poly model, and we can go ahead and start exporting. So now let's take a look at exporting these models out. The first thing that I want to do is go ahead and export out the sub D, the high poly model. And keep in mind, this is a sub D model with 2 subdivisions on it. You can see that if I set this back to 0, this goes back to the original sub D model. So I make sure to keep that information there. So don't delete history of the smooth face. I did keep a backup of that here just in case I accidentally did that. So just something that you always want to do. But go ahead and select that and then do a file export selection right over here. Now, once you do this file export selection, you can just navigate to whatever folder. In this case, I'm in my Maya projects folder, in my substance, and then export. I'm just going to call this grenade underscore high. All right, so I'm going to then use just these normal or current preset of just auto media entertainment. All right, I'll go ahead and export that. And it's going to go ahead and think, and then export and do its thing. And then I'll go ahead, select the low poly one, hit Control-1 to isolate, press that a couple times to toggle, and then I'm going to take this one now and do a file export selection. And we're just simply doing this as the low poly and the high poly using the default FBX presets. So we have underscore low, and there we go. We can do export selection. Very straightforward part of the process. Now let's jump into Substance Painter. So if I go ahead and open up Substance Painter, here we are here. So this is a clean blank scene within Substance Painter. And what I want to do now is go ahead and set up the model with UDIMs. So if I go to File, New, we want to go ahead and just use the standard PBR metallic roughness workflow. We're going to select the low poly model here. So I'll select low. And then I want to set the document resolution. I typically bump that up to 2K. If you have a lower end machine, I would work at 1K, but it doesn't matter as far as you can export at a higher resolution. Normal map, fine. DirectX, and then here's the important one, use UV tile workflow. So if I go ahead and enable that and then preserve UV layout per material and enabling painting across tiles, that's exactly what I want. I don't need anything else here. I don't need any cameras or any UVs, and everything else is the same. So you can take a look at what I'm using here and then simply do OK and import, and then give that a second, and then there you go. Here's our low poly grenade. All right, so we can see if we go ahead and double check, that's a low poly wireframe. Now, to confirm though that you do have UV tiles or UDIM tiles, there we go, look at that, right? So we made sure, you'll notice right off the bat, this new icon that you wouldn't see unless you have UDIMs. And then you can see clearly in the 2D to 3D view, so if you toggle between F1, F2, and F3, you'll see that the UDIMs are here. And this is using 1001, 2, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. All right. So now that we know that our UDIMs are here and they're working properly, we can go ahead and do the baking that we want. All right. So we now imported it. We verified our UDIMs are there. And then we go to texture set settings and we scroll down a bit, and then we go to mesh maps here. And then I just do bake mesh maps. All right, so now what I want to do is I will go ahead and set this to 2K. You can work at a much lower resolution if you want. And then I want to make sure here under our common settings is under high definition meshes, I want to go ahead and add in the grenade high. All right, so go ahead and do that. We brought that in. And the next most important thing that we want to do is take a look at this where we have match. It says always. We want to change that from match always, which is going to do the entire model, to match by mesh name. So go ahead and do by mesh name. And then keep in mind, we want our low poly prefix being underscore low and then underscore high for the high poly. And you can see that if I go back in here, we have the underscore low for all of our individual meshes here. And then we have our underscore high here on all of our high poly mesh for our high surface detail. All right, so back to Substance Painter. That's all working. And then I pretty much am just going to use the default settings here and see how it does. The other thing is just if you double check under Material ID, it is using color source as material color. So you can do this with vertex colors or mesh IDs or something like, or anything else like that. But for now, I'm going to simply keep it at material color. So if I go back to common, and then I guess one thing is you can double check here now that you have UDIMs, you can see that you can individually select the UV tiles that you want to bake. So that is also an option. So not only would you have, if you had multiple texture sets, you can individually bake out the UDIM tiles. So you wouldn't have to go through and bake all 35 textures again. But since this is the first time, let's go ahead and bake the textures, and I'm going to go ahead and let that run. Okay, and there we go. So that went ahead and finished. And let's take a look at our model. So far, so good, because we went ahead and set up the material or the naming conventions, and then I will take a look at the material IDs. Everything baked out very, very cleanly. I did some earlier tests without using mesh by name, and I ran into quite a bit of artifacts. So if you follow this technique, this is definitely going to save you some heartache later down the road. But this, all in all, looks really, really clean. And then of course I can bump up the resolution or do some include aliasing. So if you actually hit Control-Shift-B, and to help minimize what's called aliasing here in this area there, you can actually scroll down to anti-aliasing and you can tell it to subsample, and that's going to help. It's going to definitely take longer, but it's going to help reduce that issue, or just bump up the resolution of the bake textures. Okay, so now that we have that, and if we actually take a look here, you can see where it's at in our project settings. You can see that all of our normal textures that baked out here now have a big old number 5, and that's 5 for the number of UDIM tiles that we have here. So let's quickly, the last thing I want to do is just quickly show you how to use these UV tiles as the final setup. So for example, I'm going to go to Smart Materials here, and I'm going to grab a metal material. So I'll use just this steel painted rough damaged, and I'm going to go ahead and drop that in on the texture set. So here's a difference that I'm talking about. You can see now that we have texture set lists. So our texture sets are based off of this one material that we have. Okay. Then within this texture set, we have all of these UV tiles. Now we can combine this with using masks. So if I select this folder now, okay, and actually before I set the mask, I'll go ahead and set this UV tile mask, right? So set this UV tile mask by now disabling anyone that I don't want. So I know I'm not going to use these middle ones. So if all I'm simply doing is hovering in the 3D viewport, you can actually simply left click, boom, and see now it has disabled that. Okay, so it went ahead and just disabled that, or you can just hit this checkbox here, and then there you go. Okay, great. So now that I've done that, I can go ahead and exit out of that here, out of my UV tile masks, and go back to painting here. So what I'll do now is grab a red painted, so we can maybe just use that as a contrasting color on the interior. So I'll go ahead here, and you can see that I'll do just steel painted, maybe this brighter one here, steel painted, and I'll drop that at the very top here. Okay, so obviously it's affecting everything. So you can also right click and exclude all tiles, and then just bring back the 2 or 1 or 2 that you want. Okay, now what I want to do is, you can see that they're overriding each other, but if I want to only affect these inner parts, these inner pieces, let's do that as a mask. So if I select this folder here, right click, add black mask. So now that we have that black mask, we can go ahead and mask off this inner area as a material ID. So if you remember, if I go back to this high poly subd version, look at that. This is a completely separate material for my mask. Okay, if this was all green, I wouldn't be able to do this, and I'd have to manually create this mask or create it as a separate texture set. So if I go back into Substance Painter, and you can see that I have this black mask here, I go ahead now, right click on the black mask, and then I go down to add color selection. Now I can use essentially my ID mask, which is auto connecting it from when we baked it as a material ID, and I want to do pick color. So once I do pick color, look at that. All of these colors now are coming from our high poly model that we set up with materials as our material IDs. So go back to Substance Painter and select the blue, and would you look at that? Now I have the black as the main, black metal painted. Then I have the red painted on the inside, which is scraped and chipped. And then there you go. And so I can start setting that up with materials, separate materials, with masks, with the combination of using the UV tile masks here. Now, keep in mind, if I did go ahead and add, these, if I added another section here, none of this is going to be affected because I'm using these black masks here. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're working through, or I should say I should turn that off, and then I can add this UV tile, and then you can see that it adds that entirely there. Okay, and then if I add this one, the two differences being that I am using a black mask here for the insertions here, these inserted extrusions, and then this one's just using a UV tile mask. So by combining UV tile masks with black masks and material IDs, you have incredible amount of control. Now you can take that one step further. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and remove that one here. And we can go back to just regular painting here, and I'll go actually remove this. And we want to just look at kind of our normal paint. And one thing you can do here is if you maybe create a new layer here, so I'll just do like maybe just a normal paint layer that I'll add on the top. You can see I can put the custom tiles on. You can actually set which ones that you want. So if I disable these other two, and then I go back to this paint layer, and then I can use this icon here, which is paint strokes, ignored mask UV tiles. I can remove any UV tiles that I don't want, because keep in mind, for when it comes to UDIMs and UV tiles, that all this is doing right here is it is allowing you to paint. You can see that once I simply flip that on, it's actually applying it, but it's just masking it. Okay, when you want to specifically paint, you can use the setting here, paint strokes, and ignore mask UV tiles. So then if I select that and go back to UV tiles, you can see now I can actually take a look at the inner piece here that I have for the internal pieces. So actually it's 4, and then there we go. I can take a look now and start painting on this internal piece. Okay, so that about covers it. And then the last thing is, if you wanted to, you could combine that with multiple texture sets with UDIMs and multiple materials. So if you wanted to, as usual, you could go back to your low poly here. And if I wanted to maybe just simply separate out the internal pieces here, so I can grab these, I would just simply select this material, assign a new one, so it's a different color, and then I'd go ahead and apply that and bring that back into Substance Painter. So I'll do that really quick and then show you what I'm talking about. Okay, and here you are. So now you can see that I've went ahead and assigned a separate material for the internals that is separate from the rest of the low poly. So you can see that if I grab this internal piece, it's a darker separate material. You can see here under this, it's grenade internals matte, and then this one is simply just the grenade matte, okay, as in materials. And so now that I'm in here, I have grenade internals as a separate texture set, but it's still following the same UDIMs, right? I've changed nothing about how I've set anything up, but all I did was just give it a separate texture set. So I can actually take a look now, and you can use this where I can actually hide the grenade itself as a texture set if you don't want to use this or as a different workflow, okay? So I wanted to make sure that you understood how to combine texture sets, how to combine UV tile masks, how to combine the regular layer masks here, and then how to combine folder masks here that you can see, and to combine that with Material IDs to get incredible organization and control over how you handle UDIMs. And this is the workflow that I'm going to use to essentially texture this entire grenade. So this video is just taking you through the process of bringing it in from Maya all the way into Substance Painters with keeping UDIMs, keeping UDIM support, and then allowing you for complete control and organization. So that wraps up the video. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any comments or suggestions, let me know down below. And I will be covering how to texture this grenade, or at least some techniques that I'll be using in a future video. So with that, I'll see you guys around and stay safe.